Samizdat is a Russian term that is most often translated as self-publishing. Specifically, it refers to the illegal practice of circulating texts that were banned by the Soviet Union. It got its start in the 1950s when Khrushchev came into power and allowed for some liberalization of Soviet media with his de-Stalinization campaign. This need for the self-publishing to be underground was due to the fact that censorship was still strictly enforced by the Soviet government. The practice was more commonly done on an individual and spontaneous basis rather than in an organized fashion, such as a literary journal or chronicle. Samizdat writings had to be created on portable typewriters rather than larger ones, because all the larger typewriters were registered by the KGB. Samizdat writers printed on very thin paper and carbons and could even produce 8 to 10 copies at one time. They then would distribute the copies to others, who would commonly type up their own copies to give to their friends. However, those who possessed and distributed these copies were risking a lot, for if they were caught, they would most likely be imprisoned. Those involved in the creation and distribution of Samizdat were considered dissidents in the dissident movement during the 1960s. They sought to spread writings and accounts of the conditions in labor camps and the vast occurrences of human rights infringements in their socialist state. Human rights activists published the Chronicle of Current Events from 1968 to 1982 as a Samizdat human rights dispatch, even with its creators being violently persecuted and placed in labor camps and psychiatric prisons. Another very famous example of Samizdat is Alexander Solzhenitsyn's book, The Gulag Archipelago, which was published in 1973 outside the USSR, where it became a phenomenon. It effectively exposed the Gulag to the rest of the world and caused the people to want to side with the dissidents rather than the Soviet government. Many became outraged when Solzhenitsyn was stripped of his citizenship and exiled, and so they wrote the Moscow Appeal, in which they demanded that his work be published, other works of similar nature be published, the creation of a committee to investigate the reported crimes, and the protection of Solzhenitsyn from persecution, and the opportunity for him to work in his home country. All of this exposure of the practices of the USSR had some effect on the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, other nations were well aware of the horrible treatment of the political prisoners in the labor camps, and were severely criticizing the Soviet government in its punishment of dissident writers and the infringement on their human rights. Glasnost was a policy that called for openness in the Soviet Union government, in contrast with the secrecy that the nation had for so long held so dear. It was implemented by Gorbachev during his Soviet presidency in the 1980s with its goal to include more people in the political process by way of freedom of expression. Media censorship decreased, allowing writers to expose the Soviet government much more freely than they were able to during Khrushchev's period, which only slightly created more openness. Now the criticizing of Soviet government officials was allowed, another freedom resembling those of the Western countries. Never before had the Soviets experienced these freedoms. While Gorbachev's new reform was revolutionary, it did not achieve what he had wanted. In fact, there was a surge of openness, revealing the many crimes occurring in the nation, which created panic in the people. Protests increased, for the nation was used to living under a strict government and could not handle its newfound freedoms. But despite these consequences, Gorbachev was awarded the 1990 Nobel Peace Prize for the openness he brought about in Soviet society. But only 1 year later, the Soviet Union collapsed, primarily due to the collapse of its economy, but also due to glasnost and its creation of social unrest. Joseph Brodsky was one of Russia's most esteemed poets, and was greatly affected by the Soviet strict censorship policies. He began writing poetry when he was 18, and is recognized by Anna Akhmatova as the most gifted lyric voice of his generation. He was able to share a good deal of his poetry, for he was writing during the Khrushchev thaw, when the media was more liberalized. His work was regarded by many with great endearment, especially one of his earlier poems titled Pilgrims, and his work has even been compared to that of other greats in verse, such as Eliot and Lowell. However, when the end of the Khrushchev thaw came abruptly, Brodsky was arrested a year later when the Soviet regime happened to stumble upon him and his ability for widespread greatness. After being placed in a miserable mental hospital while going through trial, he was finally sentenced to 5 years of exile and labor. However, his experience during his sentence was not typical. He spent his time up north in a cottage where he was able to receive visitors. When a brave journalist created a samizdat of the transcript of his trial and sent it abroad to be published in multiple languages, others started a campaign to achieve an early release for Brodsky. Brodsky was released after 18 months of his 5-year sentence and returned to Leningrad, where he had become world famous. However, in 1972 he received a true exile sentence, where he was forced to pack his bags and go to Vienna. He then moved to the States. This exile would last the rest of his life. Brodsky received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1987 at age 47, being one of the youngest to have ever received the prize in literature. The world loved his writing and reacted very strongly upon his exile, furthering the Soviet Union's criticism, eventually leading to its collapse.